Hello, everyone. We are Amicus Brain. Amicus Brain Innovations, Inc. is a digital health technology startup focused on bringing the power of artificial intelligence technology, AI, to transform care management for people living with neurodegenerative diseases. We're about making technology solutions available to everyone to reduce caregiver stress, to increase self-efficacy, and enable people living with dementia to remain at home longer. Our AI advisor apps make dementia caregiving easier, taking out the complexity and saving precious time over the progression of the disease. In the US, November is National Family Caregivers Month, and we're delighted to begin this month with this session, bringing two experienced dementia caregivers together for a candid conversation sharing their experiences along their multi-year journeys of caregiving. The first part of the event will be facilitated by Gita Iyer. As the second part, if there's time, I'll come into the conversation and ask about how technology could have provided meaningful support that caregivers need throughout the dementia progression. We'll then have questions and answers from everyone. As you listen, please use the chat to share your experiences, make your comments, and raise questions. Now over to Gita, who will introduce our guest. Gita.
Thank you, Edie, and thank you to Amicus Brain Innovations for hosting this conversation. I came to know our guest, Michael, through one of the many online support groups that I was part of when I was a dementia caregiver for my father. As some of you may know, hundreds, perhaps thousands of daily posts go through, and over a period of time, you get to know some of the caregivers and their story. And Mike's posts always stayed with me for a couple of reasons, I think. One is he's a writer, so he writes in a very engaging and impactful way. So his story always touched me. And the second reason is I knew very little about early onset or young onset dementia. I did not know that Alzheimer's could affect someone as young as 45. So I was curious, so I followed, I started reading his blog posts and learned a lot more about his journey with dementia. So here we are. I'm in Mumbai and Mike is in California. And thanks to technology, we are all here together, and we are able to get a firsthand account of his journey with dementia. So I will now request Mike to introduce himself. I also want to spotlight two other important people in the story, his son, Lucas, and his wife, Rebecca. So if you will please introduce yourself and your son and your wife. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Mike. I have been, I was doing this for 6 years. My wife, she and I met way back in 2003, and perhaps the kindest and most generous person I've ever known. And we married in 2004, and we had, we had gotten together pretty quickly, and in our mid-30s, and we were, felt like time was running low, and we wanted to have children, and we got married fairly quickly, and had really what seemed like a great middle-class American life. Everything was going well, had good jobs and engagement with the community, and we had a son born in 2007, and things seemed to be going great until, they weren't. And we had later on, when she started showing symptoms, we had to get things checked out. Our son was born in 2007. And so he was, Lucas was only 6 years old when his mom was diagnosed. Early onset, they're still learning a lot about it, but early onset Alzheimer's, they used to think it was all related to certain family genetic conditions. And, it turns out that's not always the case. Sometimes it just happens and we don't really know why. My wife was diagnosed at the age of 45. She'd been showing symptoms for at least 2 to 3 years by that point. And so it was, one of the unusual things, trying to raise a young child with a spouse with dementia was an additional challenge. And we worked through it. Our son is almost 14 now, but he was 6 when she was diagnosed.
So yeah, thank you for that introduction. So your son is in school now. What does he do?
Yes, he's in school today. They're back in school. The pandemic was a pretty difficult time for them. And they're still taking precautions. But he's back in school and for the most part doing really well.
So I want to come back to your wife, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have read that she was a voracious reader, and she also used to write, and she had many interests. And if there's one poem that she wrote, Kaleidoscope Rain, and that really, I've shared it with many people in the support groups that I'm part of and with my friends. And every time I read it, it really, touches me. So will you, if you don't mind, can we start by reading
and
that
just
poem?
By the way of some context, of course, some of the early symptoms of dementia involve losing words. And Rebecca was someone who had always been very fond of words. She was, as you said, a voracious reader. When she was a teenager, she used her language as a weapon in arguments she would have with her parents. And her vocabulary became something of a weapon, that she would use. She loved words. She loved language. And one of the many symptoms that people experience is the loss of words. We'd have conversations and the word just would not come to her, a very common word, usually the noun. It just would not come to her. And she was getting frustrated and she did not know what was going on. I found this poem actually after she passed. Rebecca passed in June 2020. And I think it was a month or two later, as I was going through some things, I found, one of her many, she had lots of notebooks, and I found this notebook with this poem in it. And it gives a real insight into the early stages, because this poem was actually written about a year before she was diagnosed. So we knew something was going on. We didn't know what it was, because she was, again, at the time, just 44 years old. Alzheimer's was not remotely on our radar. We had no idea it could be anything dementia related. There was just something going on with her brain that words were disappearing and other symptoms were happening. And so let me pull up the poem, and I apologize if my voice cracks. It's not always easy to read these things. And so I just found this in this notebook, and luckily I was able to find an online publication that was interested in publishing it, and she called it Kaleidoscope Brain. It reads, pictures, flashes of light, tiny moments of meaning unconnected, but still joined in the impulses of the slippery brain I have treasured. Excuse me. Spelling errors multiply as they swirl around the drain where my brain used to survive and thrive. Is that what I meant to say? What were we talking about? Can you see this confusion and barely suppressed terror? In my eyes, words are my treasures, translations of experiences rolled in meaning and emotion. I run after my words, begging them to glance backward, to wait for me. How can I lose my words without losing myself? Am I my words? Are the words me? How can I separate the soul from the body and still remain whole? Don't run from me, my beloveds. Stay with me. Dance with me, laugh with me, cry with me. Lie down beside me and offer me the greatest gift. So, yes, this was about a year before she was diagnosed. And so she still had many of her abilities and her ways of thinking through things, and she could recognize what was going on, and she was able to bring the words out at a moment, when she was relaxed enough. And then other times, the symptoms sometimes would come and go in early stages, and the words would not be there, but it was terrifying to be losing some of the, the things that you had treasured so much.
I think, I mean, thank you for reading. I know it must have been very difficult. It was heart-wrenching for me. And every time it just shakes my core. So she wrote this, and you said you did not know about it for a few years, right? But in the early stages, for me, it's interesting that to see her, what she's going through, that she's able to express that in spite of her losing her words. It's very poignant. I mean, she has expressed it, really conveyed what she's going through. Were there any other signs? Did she share with you what she was experiencing? Any other feelings that she was going through at that time?
Yes, I mean, we would see it day to day. The early symptoms tended to be things like missed appointments. In the early stages, and even after she was diagnosed for a bit, she was the one who was taking our son to school in kindergarten, and she was volunteering in the school, teaching, sharing artwork with the kids in kindergarten and first grade. She never had a problem taking our son to school, getting him to school every day on time. Any other appointments that she had, made it, there were regular appointments, you made it to those on time. But an irregular appointment, like a haircut or a dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment that was not on a regular day-to-day schedule, she would lose them. She would forget, they'd be on the wrong day. She would write things down on the calendar, but what was on the calendar on the wall and the calendar in her phone would not match. One of the earliest clear signs, I mean, I think it goes back probably to 2011, with this summer, and she asked me to come with her to some of her appointments with her therapist, which were in Fresno. And that summer, I think, went up there 3 or 4 times to her appointments, and we would be there on the wrong day or the wrong time. And it was very confusing. I would, and so you can end up with, sometimes in the early stages, a lot of low-level conflict in your relationship because you don't know what's going on and you don't know why. And so, yeah, there were a lot of missed appointments. The other things were things that, in conversation, she would repeat herself. She would say something she had just said 30 seconds before with no idea that she had said it, no memory of it whatsoever. Or she would ask a question that I had just answered 30 seconds before, because the short-term memory is what goes first. And with the short-term memory going, those conversations would get a little disjointed, and it would, it gets a little unbelievable. Like, how do you not remember? We just talked about that. And so eventually we just had to recognize this was something more than, just someone being flaky for a moment. This was something more significant, more real.
Okay. So, so that took you to the point of going to a doctor and getting her diagnosed.
Yeah.
So what is the process of diagnosis? What tests did they do? And
yeah, and of course we live in a small rural town in Central California, about 60,000 people. And so there's a total of 1 neurologist in our town. And of course we could have driven a little farther, but there were a couple of different other symptoms. She was having headaches, which seemed a little bit like migraines, but not exactly like migraines. She didn't have all the symptoms of migraines, and they were prescribing her. Her doctor was prescribing her some medications for the migraines that we didn't know what was going on there, and so the headaches were kind of a parallel symptom, not directly related to the other symptoms, but we didn't know. And so between the headaches and the other the memory signs, I just finally asked, okay, do you want to see a neurologist? And she agreed. And then, initially, of course, she was an independent person. She was going to these appointments with her doctors on her own. Later on, I would, of course, join her at her appointments. And so she saw a neurologist. I mean, they did a number of tests locally. She did, blood work. They test for vitamin deficiencies. That's one of the easy things, especially with a younger person. There's certain vitamin deficiencies that can cause dementia-like symptoms. And those, luckily those can be easily corrected if you, or easily dealt with. And And then they did a spinal tap at one point, so, MRIs and brain scans and things. And finally, her neurologist was, looking at her work and said, maybe this is something like multiple sclerosis. She was seeing, there's a little spot on your brain scan. I'm not really sure what it is. Let's get you checked out for multiple sclerosis. And remember, she's in her 40s. So Alzheimer's was not on anyone's radar, not ours, not the doctor's really. And so she sent us up. We went to UC San Francisco. There are a couple of, other hospitals in California that we could have gone to, but we ended up choosing UC San Francisco, and met with a doctor there who specializes in multiple sclerosis. And he looked at her scans and, this is not multiple sclerosis. And at first, he was just going to kind of put us off and like, you need to go, you need to think about other things. And she, in the office just burst into tears, and she started talking more about her memory things. And finally it clicked for him that the memory problems were the biggest issue. And we ended up getting an appointment in the same hospital in what's called the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF. And it takes several appointments. Dementia is not something you don't do it with, you don't get a diagnosis with a quick blood test. It takes multiple appointments over time. And her doctors, of course, wanted to check, many of the same things, especially vitamin levels. They were concerned, her doctor there was concerned with that. Maybe some of the headache medications that she had been taking might cause bounce back headaches, but also might even be causing her other symptoms. And I remember as we were walking away from one of the appointments one time, dementia again still wasn't on our radar, and he just said something like we're walking out of the appointment, and it's like I think if we change these medications, it'll probably take care of this. I don't think it's anything like early onset Alzheimer's or anything like that. And we just laughed because it hadn't occurred to us. Despite the fact that we were in the Memory and Aging Center, it still had not really occurred to us that this might be something like Alzheimer's. And it was 6 months later, we came back to the appointment and we were sharing that the symptoms were continuing to progress. And one of her best friends came with us to the appointment. And we're both, kind of sharing how symptoms had changed and how she wasn't able, following and having a conversation was getting more difficult. Rebecca would be, I remember one time she was going to make a trip and I said, okay, you're going to drop off our son Lucas at my mom's, and then you're going to go to the train station and you're going to take the train to this. And just following that series of steps was impossible. The conversation was 15, 20 minutes of going in circles and circles because she couldn't remember the purpose of the trip, why she was going, where she was going, and the steps that it would take to get there. And so we talked to the doctor about all of those, and he starts going into this series of things like, okay, well, there are studies you can get into, there are clinical trials, they're not all that promising, but you can get into clinical trials, and there's some studies. And then finally it clicked. I was realizing, wait, you're not talking about early onset Alzheimer's, are you? And he said, absolutely, that's what I'm talking about. And so it's very, very sudden. In his defense, we were in the Memory and Aging Center, but it was a very surprising diagnosis. She had just turned 45. And so, but yeah, it was a very surprising diagnosis. But the process, even once we started seeing neurologists, probably took at least 1.5 years, maybe longer, because you have to have a lot of tests and you have to go through, you have to really track your progress over time. And the thing is, a lot of it really takes place because from the reports from the people around, the loved ones of the patient. It's not from the patient themselves. They're not always the best person to report these things. And so she could talk about what was going on, and she could go through memory tests and other kinds of neurocognitive tests, and there are a whole bunch of them that they go through. But a lot of it really comes from the way I could describe. And so keeping track of the different behaviors, keeping track of the different things that she was experiencing, and her friends keeping track, and one of her best friends coming with us to that other appointment really helped, because she could describe conversations they were having over the phone, and how the conversations had changed over time. They had known each other since they were 4, but in the recent years, the conversations just on the phone had changed. And so
once, I mean, that sounds very difficult and painful. And also because there's so much uncertainty and, okay, not knowing what it was going to be. But once you knew that it was early onset, I mean, obviously, did you know what it meant and what was that it was going to progress? And because when I started, I didn't, like I mentioned to you, that I didn't know that I was hoping still that my dad would get better. So did you know what was going to happen in the future, and that you had to plan for it? And did your wife understand any of this? That because you had to have planned some of this with her, was her involved?
It's kind of a combination, because I mean, I knew a little bit about Alzheimer's, largely just from what's in pop culture and TV shows. I didn't have any experience with it in my family. My grandmother probably had a bit of dementia before she passed, but she was never diagnosed. And so I knew it would progress. I knew that it was a terminal condition, and that it was going to progress. I didn't know a lot about the details, but also we were in a little bit of denial at first, because she was 45, and even her doctor, her primary care doctor, was surprised when we came back with the diagnosis, and oh, really? And she went ahead and prescribed the medication that, the Aricept that had been recommended by the specialist at UCSF, because there was no real harm in doing so. But she was a little surprised, and it was a few months before we came to, before we were really sure. And because she was able to participate in some of the research studies that they had going on at UCSF, she was able to have some additional testing. She was able to have PET scans, which often are not covered by insurance. One of the things that people don't realize is, there's no blood test. The only 100% definitive test for Alzheimer's is autopsy. There's, and so there's sometimes misdiagnosis while the patient is still around. But the PET scans are about as close as we can get, because they can track the glucose traveling through the brain. They can track the what are called beta amyloid proteins that are affected by the Alzheimer's. And now they have a newer one that she got later that tracks the tau as well. And they can see what they call these, I believe they're called neurofibrillary tangles, and the plaques that literally over time trap and tangle up your synapses and eventually start killing brain cells. And so they can see those things happening in the brain. And once she had those PET scans, and the doctor reported that back to me, and I was seeing the symptoms continue to progress, after a few months, I was finally realizing, okay, this does sound more like Alzheimer's. When I was initially looking up symptoms, this doesn't sound, there's so many other things that it could be, but no, it was after a little while, it did sound like Alzheimer's. From Rebecca's point of view, I mean, she was always better off not thinking about it. And so on a day-to-day basis, she really would not spend time thinking. She didn't go and do research. She didn't obsess. She just tried to focus on other things, tried to keep her mind focused elsewhere. And so I would look things up. I would look up all kinds of things about Alzheimer's, about early onset, which there's more information than there used to be, still very limited information. Of course, in America, we have this series of, this book series called For Dummies, and they'll do software, different software. And I got the Alzheimer's for Dummies. And it was an older edition, unfortunately, or it was what was available at the time, but it was written in 2004. And the section on early onset was about a paragraph long, and it said that it was familial. it was all familial, and that actually is not the case. And fortunately, that book has been updated. There were a couple of things I didn't like about it. But we did eventually, it took us some time. We did eventually start making some financial plans, medical plans, and legal. Really, it works differently in different countries and different states. But here in the United States, probably anyone, what I've been told is anyone over the age of 18 should have what's called a power of attorney document. So that if you're ever unable to take care of yourself, or if you're ever unable to express your wishes, that your financial decisions, someone can make financial decisions for you and medical decisions for you. So you just designate someone. And for someone who's not expecting anything to go wrong, it's a really simple document. You can find them easily online. Of course, because we had a young child at home, some of that got a little bit more involved, and we met with an attorney. It was actually probably 2017 by the time we got all the paperwork and everything done. We don't have complicated assets, but we had to plan for, and that conversation that people really don't want to have, which is, who's going to take care of your child if you both are gone? Because many caregivers actually end up having problems and passing before the person for whom they're caring. So we had to be prepared for that possibility. And so we met with an attorney, and, in a couple of meetings, we got all of that arranged and taken care of, got the paperwork done. And the financial stuff, you can't plan for every possibility. You just have to hope that you have to take it as it comes along, because I did not know, you don't really know how long the person will live and what kind of care they're going to need. And so you have to think about how much you can care for them at home, whether they might need more advanced care, whether they might need someone to come into the home, or skilled nursing care, and how long they might need that. It's something that's very difficult to plan out ahead of time, because you won't really know.
So beyond the planning that you had to do, what were some of the daily challenges that you had to face as her dementia progressed?
Well, day to day, early on, we were trying to live our lives. And, because this disease progresses gradually, a person still has many of their abilities, and they kind of gradually fade away. I remember there was a comment she made to me fairly early on that she said, "I don't want to get small." And that one stuck with me, because it was something that happened. She had to gradually, disengage from certain activities. She had been singing at church, and she continued to do that for as long as she could. She sang and performed in some local, little talent things that we have at the college where I work. And she did artwork. She loved to scuba dive. She loved to participate in all kinds of activities, and trying to continue to do as many of those things as possible. On a day-to-day basis, I was working a full-time job, trying to make sure she was okay. And sometimes my job, there was a couple of different periods of time where my job had me working 2 or 3 days a week at our district office 50 miles away. And so she was in the early stages at home, and I'm 50 miles away, and sometimes she would call me and things would progress, and there would be a conversation. She would have lost her glasses or some item, and I'm having to try to help her find where something is from a distance. And our son was at school. She was taking him to school, and she was helping out with artwork in the classroom, right up through when she was diagnosed, and actually for almost a year after she was diagnosed. She continued that well into when our son was in first grade. And then, of course, when she lost her driver's license, in the United States, in much of the United States, we do not really have great public transit. We have some public transit in our small town, but it's not, it's rather limited. And so not having a driver's license means a lack of independence. And so there was, you know, when she lost her driver's license, that was a big challenge. So it was day to day, the working and trying to make everything, every little detail, every little happening for her work as well as it could. And trying to raise a child and explain to him things in age appropriate ways, but age appropriate is difficult. When he was 6 when she was diagnosed, and so he grew up with this. And so I would try to explain in a way that he could understand along the way.
So when at some point of time, you could not leave her at home, right? It was not safe to leave her alone at home while you were at work. So I know you had to put her in a daycare. So were there adequate resources like that, you know, how was that working out for her?
Yeah, and I mean, we were lucky enough. I mean, you know, we're not wealthy, but we're solidly middle class, and we live in an area that is fairly low cost. At first, what I did, I thought, you know, we hired a caregiving service that would come in, and just 3 hours a week, I wanted her to get used to it, to have someone come in. But gradually, I just felt less and less comfortable with her being home alone for long periods of time. And we have a wonderful location, a wonderful organization in our town called Valley Adult Day Services. And they take patients who, most of whom are older people with dementia, but some are younger and have other cognitive or other issues. And they care for them in the daytime so that their loved ones can work, can do other things that they need to be doing. And so Rebecca had actually visited Valley Adult Day Services once early on. She had stopped by there and met with them, with her mother and one of her best friends, and they asked questions and things. And you know, we knew that it was a great service and a wonderful place, but at the same time, most of the people there were 30 to 40 years older than she was. And she didn't, I mean, she did better when she didn't have to think about her symptoms, her condition, and all of the things. And so she did not really want to be there. And so when it kind of came to a point where I was going to have to insist, and I was going to have to make the call, I said, I finally signed her up. I said, you know, we're just going to do this. We're going to go 1 day a week. I have to go 1 day a week. And that was actually one of the most difficult days we had. Our son was supposed to have an event at school right before school. They have these little things, muffins with moms, and you go and you have a little, you know, muffin and with your mom, and right before school, and then you go into class. And that morning I was just getting her ready, and she seemed in a great mood, and he was happy because, oh, she's going to be able to do the muffins with mom with me. And I had to, you know, just remind him, okay, well, maybe she won't be able to, you know, you'll need to walk her back out to the car so she remembers where the car is and everything. And then when we got there to school, she started crying, and I didn't, you know, I was thinking, you know, really, she doesn't remember where we're going. But she started crying, and it wasn't really clear why she was crying. And so he had to go on to school without her. And, you know, he had a lot of times to learn along the way that, you know, he had to be flexible. And so then I took her on to Valley Adult Day Services, and she was crying, didn't want to get out of the car. But they are trained, and they really know how to deal with these things. And so the executive director at the time, she just walked out in a very cheerful but also very definitive point of view, you know, voice, just came out and opened the car and said, you know, hey, come on, Rebecca, I need you to come in. I need you to come and help with things, and I need you to do some things for me. And she got her out of the car, and for a long time, I actually thought they had cameras on the door. But they didn't. They actually were just watching out the window, and very often they would meet us outside when we would show up, because she would start crying as we got there. It was only a couple of months into that, because after a while she had a seizure at home, and it was not safe for her to be at home at all by herself. And so she had, over a period of a couple of months, 3 seizures that we know of. And so after she had the first seizure, she could not be home alone. And we took her, within 5 days a week. And so when I was at work, she was at Valley Adult Day Services, and each day she would be there while I was working, and she got more used to it. And she didn't cry every day. And the thing is, and people sometimes don't like the comparison to children, but it is in some ways like dropping off a child at school for the first time, and the teacher will always the parents need to go, and the child gets used to it very quickly. And it's the same. It was the same for her. Once I left, she was usually good within a few minutes, and she had a good time while she was there. And she usually enjoyed the place, and she would hug them, and she would tell them she loved them. And she really had a good time, and they had a piano there, and she would play piano, and she would sing with them. She would dance when it would rain. She would go out and dance in the rain, which is something she had done with our son sometimes. But that part of you don't want to be worried that something bad is going to happen at home. You need to get to this place. And so it was 2018 that I really had to finally say it was too much.
So I want to talk about you a little bit. I want to, you wrote this article in memory of Tom.
Yes.
And so for those who have not read this article, it's about someone in a support group that Mike was part of, online support group. And he was also caring for his wife, and he was going through a real rough time. After some time, nobody heard from him, and it turned out that he succumbed to his stress and responsibility, the weight of the responsibility. So there is a quote that you in there. So this is from Mike. Mike writes, "Caregiving is a lonely activity, even more so when caring for one's spouse. You no longer have that person to go to with your own fears, frustrations, and worries." So where did you still had your son to take care of, and you had to preserve your own self, and you had to take care of your wife that you loved dearly. So where did you go for the strength and the help that you needed? Can you please talk a little bit about your support systems, including any groups that you were able to derive comfort from?
Yes, and here in the United States, the Alzheimer's Association has some online support groups. There are in many communities, and I never really sought out the in-person, but there are many communities, they have in-person support groups that you can go to, and they have meetings, and you can go and you can probably find those in your local newspaper or wherever you get local news, because and many hospitals will have resources for those. Online support groups was what I thought would work better for me, because I thought, at first at least, I was kind of naively thinking, well, I don't really need support, I just need information. That's what I was thinking. And so, excuse me, I found some of these support groups through the Alzheimer's Association, and you can go and you can ask questions there, and you can post and share experiences and concerns. And people can even do that somewhat anonymously, because they can use a screen name and not their real name if they want to. But those, they're still valuable, but really what works, I think, better now is the social media sites have become a bit, to where people can share experiences across all kinds of places. And so there are a number of dementia support groups on Facebook. And I found a couple of those that I joined. over time. There were ones specific to early onset, and there are people who manage those groups, and many of them have thousands of people across the United States or countries across the world that will share their experiences. And a lot of it is the kind of thing that I initially was thinking. It's asking questions. What do you do when your loved one refuses to take a shower? That's a very common one. Financial questions and caregiving questions at different stages. And because the people will be in the support groups at all the various stages of the disease, and you can ask questions. And so, but there are times when you just need to rant. And
Yes.
I didn't think I needed that. But there were a couple of times I did, because you would go through a really frustrating day. And I had friends that I could talk to. I had friends locally in my community that I did share things with from time to time, but you don't want to lay that on them all the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to talk with people who understand the same experience. And so you could, so sometimes people would just rant. And so I didn't initially, the support groups, would even have in their rules of conduct, that this is a no judgment. This is just, we're here about support. We're not here to provide. And I didn't even understand the point of that at first. But it really was, you need to hear from people who are going through the same experience. You need to talk with people who are dealing with the same thing that you are. And being able to do that was very important. So, we know that many of the social media sites can have a lot of toxic behavior on them, and there's no exception. Certainly Facebook has its many problems, but this is something that you're able to do through these groups that I don't think there's another easy place anywhere else to get this kind of support, whether it's information or just guidance and empathy. So going to these places was actually ended up being really important.
I completely agree with you, because that's how we met. I was part of many of the same support groups, and they're all going through, they understand. I remember with my dad, once I had a meltdown. I was on the phone with my friend from the US, and I didn't realize something happened, and I didn't realize I didn't turn off the phone. And I had this meltdown, and then I came back and said, oh my God, I was just appalled that my phone was on, and she heard the whole thing. And it is just because you think that they won't understand what you're going through. So I think to be in a place where people are going through similar experience is very important. So do you mind talking about the decision to place her? Was it, I'm sure it was very difficult. Nobody makes that difficult easily. It's not an easy decision. So how did you go about researching the place? And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and it got more complicated for us because of the pandemic as well. And so we had gotten into 2020, and the pandemic was happening, and in March I had gone, my job had changed, where I was now working from home for, we thought it might be just a month or so, but it turned out to be a year and a half. I'm back this week, working pretty much every day, back at work. But for the vast majority of the last year and a half, I've been working the majority of the time, and sometimes all the time, at home. But what happened, the college where I work went on spring break, and then they realized what was going on and how quickly COVID was spreading across the community and across the world. And they gave the students an extra week of spring break, and the faculty a week to prepare, and said, we're going fully online, and all of the employees are working from home. And then the stay-at-home order came down from the the governor of our state. And at the same time, there was not an order to close places like Valley Adult Day Services. They were an essential service, but they made a local decision to close for a while. Initially, it was just going to be for a couple of weeks, just for safety, because you have a lot of older, vulnerable patients there that it was very important that COVID not get into the facility and not get into and spread around. And so they closed for a while. And so now I had the experience of caring for Rebecca full-time at home while I was working full-time. And so I'm trying to sit here on a laptop trying to do my job. And while my son was also working from home because his school had gone online. And so he was mostly trying to work independently, but he would have, Zoom meetings at school, and I would have Zoom meetings at work. And sometimes they were at the same time, but we had to watch for Rebecca because she was really entering, we have these kind of informal 7 stages. She was really entering kind of the last stage, the 7th stage of the disease, where she didn't have, it was starting to affect her physically as well as mentally. It was starting to affect, her judgment even more. She would go in to sit down in places where there was not a chair, so she might fall down. And she spent a good part of the day, most of the day sometimes, just pacing around the house, pacing back and forth, walking around the house. And we had to watch and be careful for her because she would get into things. And she would get into food, which, it's good for her to have food. But just months, even a couple of months before that, when we had Halloween, she had been getting into Halloween candy, and I had to be careful because she would grab the Halloween candy and I would catch, and she would be chewing the small Halloween candy with the wrapper still on. And so there were a lot of safety issues that started happening. I was very concerned with what was going to happen. She was with the falling down. She would walk around the house, and toward the end she was falling a couple of times a day, and she would go and sit on something where there was no chair. And so I was very concerned about her injuring herself. It was getting where I was showering her one day, and she would not come out of the shower. I could not get her to come out. And so I ended up kind of taking a break, and after a little while she forgot, and then she forgot what she was upset about, and I was able to get her to come out of the shower. But it was getting to where I didn't feel comfortable showering her at home. There were a lot of safety issues, and so I started talking with her doctor. I talked with a couple of friends. I talked with people, and I didn't even know what the steps were. Here in the US, most people are placed directly from a hospital stay. If they need a placement, they're usually in the hospital, perhaps for some other. And I came to realize I had meeting with a group at Valley Adult Day Services a couple of years ago. I remember talking with people, and they that sometimes people would even conjure up a reason for the hospital stay because that was the only way they could get placement. Because the way the system works, it's such a convoluted system of supports that they would have to find a reason for a hospital stay. Unfortunately for us, the skilled nursing facilities they were taking patients, but visitation was closed down because of the pandemic. And so that added another layer of difficulty because I felt like I had to place her, that it was really time. I had been thinking about it for a while, but I knew that if I made the decision to place her, I might not see her for a while, or maybe not again, because we could not visit. And so I had phone calls with the local facility. We were lucky enough, I spoke with Rebecca's doctor, and when we had a video visit with her, and as soon as she saw Rebecca's her condition and how much she had progressed, she was certainly on board with having her placed. And she was able to recommend the same place where her grandmother was staying. So I was happy to, she had confidence in a local facility. But normally you would go in and you would put some personal items around the room, maybe decorate the place, and you would see where your loved one is going to be staying. I couldn't do any of that. I was not able to even walk in the door. But I finally felt like it was, not only was it getting difficult for me and a danger and a concern to my health and to the relationship that we both had with our son, but it was getting physically difficult for her. I was concerned that she was going to be injured around the house. And so we made the arrangements and we got the financial details, and we finally just had it. And she was at a place at that point where she didn't really know what was going on day to day, and I couldn't explain it to her. And so, we just took her the one day, and she didn't really have a full understanding of what was going to happen. So it's very difficult to make that call. At that point, she wasn't eating well either. And so we were, using some of the meal supplement shakes and things to help with that. But her not eating continued after she was placed, and she very quickly was losing weight and things. So I think you're going to have, when you make the decision, you're going to have guilt no matter what you do, because if you keep them at home too long, you could have other problems. You could have injuries. You could have things that happen to them. And even now, because I know that the last 2 years at home were very difficult for our son. By this point, he was 12 years old, but the last couple of years were pretty rough. And that's a lot of what he remembers. So I worry that, for her sake, sometimes I wish I hadn't had to have her placed. But at times I even worry, did I wait too long? Because of the impact on him and what he had to go through.
Yeah, I remember you telling me in one of the messages that when you had the last conversation with her on FaceTime, your son didn't want to be part of that because he didn't want her to remember her like that. Yeah. I'm really sorry. This is that you had to go through this. It's in your you allude to some of your feelings about this whole experience and stolen hours, stolen years, a letter to Lucas. You talk about it. I think early onset has some unique issues where you have to work and you have a young child to take care of, and you say, but reluctant as I am to compare miseries, there is something uniquely cruel about the effect this has on a younger person. It's very true, and I agree. Having experienced dementia with an older person, I completely agree. I want to talk about some of your articles. So can you, a little more cheerful, something that brought, I'm sure you were trying to find moments of joy for yourself and for your wife. So scuba diving, she loves scuba diving, and you have written an article about diving. It's called Diving with Dementia, where you talk about her love for scuba diving and you took her on a trip. So can you just in a little bit say a little bit about that?
Yes, and the people have different ways of working through what they're dealing with. And I think one of the ways that I work, because I'm a writer, among the other things I do, and I was working on my first novel just, in the time when she was dealing with her symptoms and putting together, trying to put together a novel together. And actually, I think I got the first draft together a month or two after she was diagnosed. And so I often deal with things through writing. And so that letter that I had written to our son was one of the first things that I wrote, trying to work it out all out in my head, because it was a difficult it was a difficult thing because he was by that point just 8 years old. Still too young. I mean, I tried to speak with him about it in age appropriate ways. But age appropriate, you know, when he's 6 or when he's 8 is different from what he's capable of now. And so there were a lot of things that I could not talk with him about, but I tried to explain to him, you know, the importance of being kind when she would repeat herself, when she would ask him to do the same thing over and over again and not realize that she had already asked, and the different things. And so as he's 8 years old, I wrote this letter to him that he was not old enough to read yet. He was an advanced reader. He could have read it, but he would not have really comprehended what he was reading at that point. But I needed to write it. And so writing became therapeutic for me. But also it's a way of sharing with others what you're going through, but also what they might be going through. And there's an empathy that I think writing engenders, that people are able to find ways to understand what they're dealing with better if they see someone else express it. And so I wrote about my experience. I wrote one piece from Rebecca's point of view. You know, what does it feel like to develop Alzheimer's? I wrote about some of the things that she would do because her attempts to find joy during her experience along the way were inspiring. And so her scuba diving, which was something that she absolutely loved, it terrified me. I mean, it terrified me to begin with because I can barely swim, and she was underwater swimming literally with sharks occasionally. I mean, she swam with turtles and all kinds of sea creatures, and you know, she's underwater seeing all of the glorious things that she got to see. But as her dementia progressed and that she could not drive a car, but she could still scuba dive, it scared me even more. I was afraid that I was allowing her to take her life into her hands, and at some level I was, but she needed to do that. Because she needed to live. And so she needed to find those moments of joy in her life.
I mean,
and
I
so
can't
the
imagine.
scuba diving, the artwork, those were ways, and her singing, which I didn't write about a lot. I've been writing a memoir that I'm trying to find a publisher for now. And I talk about the singing in that a little bit, but the times when she would do performances either here at the college or occasionally, and she continued to sing at church through 2016 or 17. And the scuba diving, the artwork, and watching the artwork as it progressed, as her disease progressed, and watching what it did to her artwork, I think gives an insight into her brain. But there's so much that I think people can just learn from the way she approached what was happening to her.
So Mike, I know I can, I don't know, I'm at a loss for words, it's just, thank you for sharing this, these must be very difficult for you. For those of you who haven't read the articles, please, we will share the link to Mike's blogs. He writes about not just, he's written not just about the dementia, but also about other topics like politics, sexual harassment, many different variety of topics. Please go and read them, and you'll get a more detailed understanding of what he went through, what the family went through. I want to end this segment. It's sort of a tribute to the kind of person Rebecca was. I read this on your Facebook. Asked how she wanted to be remembered. This was Rebecca Carley's response. I wanted to see the love and goodness in this world and share it with others. I have been blessed in so many ways, and I'm grateful for all the people in my life. So truly, she was blessed to have you and your son there, and your love for both of them has come through in all your writings and everything you did. So thank you for sharing all of that with us and without holding back. And we feel it. And like you said, when you share, we understand our own experience better. So for me, going to support groups and reading somebody else's story, somehow it validates my story, what I'm experiencing, and it makes me understand it better. So thank you so much. So I think Chitra or Edie, whoever, I think there are some questions. Do we want to do questions first or the Edie?
So let me poke in here and just ask one or two questions about some of the supports you had, the technical supports when you were going through that, and then we'll throw it open to questions. There are already several questions that are in the chat. So when you first started on this journey, Michael, where did you get your information?
You know, I work as a college researcher, and so I don't have any medical training, but I was fairly knowledgeable in being able to look things up and find information. And so I was Googling. I occasionally talked to friends, and dementia is so common that we all know someone, or several someones usually, who go through this and who have dealt with it. But early on, I mean, I found books, reference books. There's one that I know has been mentioned before, called the 36-Hour Day, where people really talk about caregiving, and it's kind of a reference book where you can look up any kind of situation that you might be dealing with. That one's valuable. The one I'm not remembering the name of the author at the moment, but there was a book called Learning to Speak Alzheimer's, which I think went into a lot of how to communicate with a dementia patient, how to work with them, how to speak with them and engage. I'm glad I'm dealing with this today. I know, a few decades ago, people would be told to constantly bring their loved one back into the present, kind of make them live in today when they might really in their mind to be living in the past or in their childhood. And now we know that doesn't work. All it really does is cause them stress and cause them all kinds of difficulty. And so the best thing you can do is join them in their world. Yes. You don't need to correct them when they make mistakes. You don't need to tell them they're wrong. You don't need to pull them back into today and what's going on right now. You need to live with them and engage with them where they are. And so that book, Learning to Speak Alzheimer's, was really valuable, and some of the communication techniques I found. And then, we talked earlier, I found the online support groups tremendously helpful. You can just look for dementia caregivers. Facebook is a good resource for Alzheimer's caregivers, dementia caregivers, whatever resources there might be. Here in the United States, we have the Alzheimer's Association, and as large as they are, because the problem is so big and so there's so many of us, they can't provide personal support to everyone, but they have a lot of resources that they can get in touch with. And they're also, like I mentioned, that I'm writing, I've written a memoir which is not published yet, but there are a number of others that have been, where people have written about their personal experiences. Jonathan Kozol, who is an education writer in the United States, a well-known education writer, wrote about his experience caring for his father. There was, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but a CBS News journalist who had written about caring for his wife, and his wife also had early onset Alzheimer's, and that was the closest thing to my own experience. There was, of course, it's a novel form, but it gets the experience pretty right, called Still Alice, that was made into a movie a few years ago. And so Alzheimer's is in pop culture, in movies and television shows and everywhere. And some of them get it right more than others. And I think one of the things is the experiences vary a lot. You will see that there are a lot of people who experience certain things that you may not. But you're experiencing other things that they may not. And so there are only a few universals, but you can get a sense of what it's like from all of these, the many things that have been written elsewhere, and the support groups and the people who've gone through the same thing.
Other than having a medical background, I think being a college researcher was the best possible background you could have for this. There's so much information out there. There's so much misinformation now too, that there's really a lot. One last technology question. Did you use any technology to help you, any apps or any devices while you were caring for your wife?
Not really. She tended later on, for her, she shied away from a lot of technology later on. She shied away from social media and from a lot of her devices. She had been a reader, and she would read books on her e-reader. And then later on, of course, as reading became more difficult, I realized what she was really doing on the e-reader was just playing a solitaire game. For myself, I hadn't really done a lot of technology other than Googling symptoms and finding articles where I could and trying to find information online in various places. I wasn't looking for a lot of technological resources other than eventually the support groups. A friend told me about one of the Facebook support groups, and then I realized that there were others. And some of the groups are public, so anyone can see what you post, but many of them are private, so only members will see what are posted, and that's valuable to a lot of people who want to keep what they say. Nothing is truly private on the internet, but people can have, they can ask, instead of asking their friends who they might not want to share things with, they can ask thousands of strangers. And only the strangers who are in the group will see what the embarrassing question they may have. But other than that, I don't think we used a lot of technology at that.
What about to keep her engaged, to keep Rebecca engaged in any games or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, early on she would play with, and her artwork was something that kept her engaged for a long time. She would, wherever we were, just be drawing and draw. And so I would take her out to lunch, a local restaurant, a little sandwich shop. And as her dementia progressed, her artwork kind of reduced in scale, and she had gotten to a place where she didn't do larger pieces. She was making bookmarks and making what eventually was thousands of bookmarks. And she was, doing these designs and drawing and adding color and beautiful designs on these bookmarks. But we would go out to lunch, and then she would draw and make a bookmark, and then she would go and hand it up to the cashier and make a present of it to the cashier. And I know at least one of the restaurants locally, had those up on the wall until, for a good period of time. The artwork kept her engaged for a long period. They do need to have something occupying their mind. They need to have purpose. They need to have a reason to do things. They can't just be watching television. And so if there's a game that will keep them engaged, that is great. if there is, for her, it was artwork and other activities. The local place, the Valley Adult Day Services, was also able to help keep her engaged. Music kept her engaged. But if there's technology that would also keep someone engaged, many dementia patients are of course older, and some have mobility issues that we didn't experience, but would limit them. And so certainly if there are technology issues or technology solutions that would help them, that would be great.
Well, Amicus Brain is a technology company, and we're focused on the caregivers and trying to make it easier for them to find knowledge when they need it, from reliable evidence-based sources, without having to spend hours online Googling, trying to figure out what the good information is and what's not. Our AI advisor apps provide knowledge, advice, resources, and a private community, so that you're not on Facebook with people you don't know. That lets you have some of that, a place to engage and vent and hear from others going through the same thing. We do have some questions. I know we're past an hour, so if you can stay with us a little bit more, let me read to you some questions from the chat, okay? There is also some heartfelt thank yous on the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to watch it while you're speaking. All right, so the first one from Chitra Dorai, thanks you for what you quoted your wife as saying, that she doesn't want to be small, and ask you to please comment about the concern people living with dementia share about how to transform the way that people with dementia are viewed, engaged, and supported.
Yeah, and the way she had commented, I don't want to get small, and at some level it was inevitable, because she did start withdrawing from certain of the activities that she had loved. She was able to sing in church through a good portion of her disease, but eventually that got more difficult. She was leading church service with songs, and one of her friends who would help her keep her place in the music, because as you're in a song, the transitions, you get to the bottom of the page and then you have to go back to the top of the page, and when you have little short-term memory, you can easily lose your place in the music, and her friend would help her keep her place, and they were able to keep her engaged. I think educating people is really important, and helping people understand that just a little bit of patience and people can participate for a lot longer than they might have otherwise. And so they were able to help her continue to sing in church for a much longer time than she would have otherwise. Eventually it was going to have to stop. Eventually a lot of her other activities, she wasn't able to contribute in the way that she would have. And there were, little things, when in conversations, when she would make a comment and, sometimes you get a blank stare from people because the comment you make that a dementia patient is making isn't really following the conversation, and you can get, I think some of our friends were honestly better at this than I was, and just keeping her engaged and acknowledging what she was saying, even if it didn't quite make sense, even if it wasn't quite following the train of the rest of the conversation, just pulling her right along with everyone else. The patience, I remember asking people along the way, how do you develop patience? Because I didn't have enough of it. You never have enough patience on a day-to-day basis. And I don't have the answer to that one, but just take, one moment at a time.
I remember you writing, patience is a virtue, and I think I'm not virtuous enough, or something like that, you had written yeah.
Probably.
One last question, and then I think we'll call it a wrap. What surprised you the most over your journey? Was there anything particular from medical professionals, from the help you could get or that you could not get, available to you as a family caregiver, or what you saw in the community? What surprised you, and or what do you think should change to make it better for family caregivers?
Yeah, as far as a surprising thing, I mean, it's, as someone is progressing through dementia, it's a gradual decline, but it's not uniform. And so a person might be progressing right along and you think they can't do certain things, but then all of a sudden they're determined and they're able to surprise you. And so, yeah, things like, she was scuba diving 2 years after she lost her driver's license, and able to follow along and follow the activities and follow the instructions as well as she had. And so her ability continually, and I would have to remind myself that she needed a sense of purpose, and she was often really good at finding one for herself, but I could find ways to make that experience better for her if I helped her find and engage with that sense of purpose. And because you can't just, Alzheimer's may be a 5-year journey, or it may be 6 or 10 or even 20. But along the way, you want to make that as good a journey as it can be. And you want to help people on their day-to-day, moment-to-moment experience. As far as what can be done, I mean, there are things from a policy point of view. I'm in the United States, and there are many systems of support, from local to state to federal and private donations and organizations. I mentioned the local one that I'm now working with, Valley Adult Day Services, that provides a respite care for people on a day-to-day basis, so that loved ones can work and do the things that they need to do day to day. I think what's most difficult and what is the coordination of all of that support. The Alzheimer's Association here in the US tries to provide people and connect people to resources, but it is very difficult to find what is available in your area, find what you need, because so much of it is specific to your state or your local area. And so what's available in one place may not be available in another, or it may be very, very expensive that it just isn't reasonable. And so we were lucky enough that we, although we were not wealthy at all, but we were able to afford at least to be able to do support services like Valley Adult Day Services. And there are, local organizations that help with many of those things. But I think if there's a policy, I would love to see more people connect to what resources are available, help caregivers understand what's available to them, whether it's from the national government, the local government, or whatever it might be. Connect people with whatever it is, whatever resources they can find in their area.
Well, and that is the best call to action for a technology company that I can imagine. So thank you for that. Thank you both very much for this. Michael, your experiences are terrifying and inspiring, and I can't imagine how hard it must be to talk about them. And Geeta, thank you also so much for your careful preparation and for the lovely interview that you conducted.
Thank you, and thanks again, Mike, for it was lovely to meet you. But thanks so much for so candidly opening, sharing your story, and we learned a lot.
Yes, thank you, everyone, for listening, and I'm happy to share for those who have questions, because there are many people who are sharing with us as we went through things, and it's a needed resource. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.